Okay, if you're all ready, we'll go live in a minute.
Yeah, right.
You're already on YouTube. Okay, here we go. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this evening's HLF Online. And we have a wonderful spread for you this evening. We have two recent books on a subject that I'm sure interests all of us, which is food. The first book, ladies and gentlemen, we have is by Esther David. And the second book we have is edited by Claire Chambers. And before I formally welcome the two of them and our moderator for this evening, Ira Raja, on my own behalf and on behalf of all of you and my colleagues at HLF, let me welcome Esther David, Claire Chambers, and Ira Raja to this evening's session. And thank you all for joining us this evening. And friends, some of you might recall that Esther was with us at the physical festival a few years ago. And we all, of course, know her as a novelist. I'm sure all of us are familiar with her probably best known novel, The Walled City, but also her other novels like the Book of Esther and Book of Rachel. And she's a Sahitya Academy winner. And this is a book, ladies and gentlemen, the latest book that we are going to discuss is titled, Ben Appetit. This is about Jewish food in India. And the second book that we are going to discuss with Claire Chambers, the editor of the book, is titled Desi Delicacies. And these two books tell us about two very different cuisine. But of course, these books are not only about food and the food traditions, but obviously, whenever we talk about food, we inevitably talk about culture, and we also talk about customs and traditions. And just a quick introduction to Claire Chambers and Ira Raja, our two other guests apart from Esther David. Claire Chambers is a professor of global literature at York, and she has written innumerable books on Muslim culture, Muslim women, Muslim lives, Muslims in Britain. And this particular book is a collection of essays and stories collected from three different countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And Ira Raja is a professor of English at the University of Delhi. And she published probably one of the earliest books on food writing from South Asia. And the speciality of that book was that it included a number of pieces from languages other than English, Indian languages other than English. So Ira Raja's book was titled The Table is Laid, and she teaches English, as I said, at the University of Delhi, and she will be moderating this session for us this evening with our two wonderful authors, Esther David and Claire Chambers. But before I hand it over to Ira, just a quick reminder to all our viewers. Some of you may have noticed that in the last 1 month or so, we have had sessions on Hindu civilization and the contribution of Parsis to the making of India. And this evening, ladies and gentlemen, we are discussing Muslim cuisine and Jewish food. This is our way of celebrating the diversity of India. And even as we observe the 75th year of modern India, this is our way, this is our homage to the diversity that makes the country that it is. So with this few introductory words, let me hand it over to Ira to continue the conversation with Esther David and Claire Chambers, with just a reminder to Ira that I'll be back on screen in about 45 to 50 minutes with audience questions. So once again, on my own behalf and on behalf of our audience and my colleagues at HLF, thank you, Esther, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Ira, for this wonderful session. And we are all looking forward, I would say, hungrily to the discussion on food. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ira.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the Hyderabad Literary Festival. I'm especially pleased to be moderating this session on food writing and for the opportunity to converse with the editors of these two new and exciting anthologies of recipes, essays, stories, anecdotes, and reflections on food. Since Vijay's already done the introductions, let me simply join him in welcoming the two guests for the evening, Esther David, who's rich and richly memoried and painstakingly collected traditional recipes from this, I think, tiny, but 5,000 strength, but widely dispersed community of Indian Jews that has just been published by HarperCollins. And I also extend a warm welcome to our second guest, Claire Chambers, whose edited volume of essays and each accompanied by a recipe to match. And I think amongst the finest that I have read in the genre that's been published by Picador India. I've immersed myself in these recipes in this last week or so, a couple of hours each night before I went to bed. A routine that reminded me of this rather disparaging comment, as a comic aside about women who read recipe books in bed, as if that was an anomaly. And the conversations I've had with many of my friends since then, tells me that a lot of people actually do that. And I think the writer of the piece also seemed to insinuate, and again, I think he was wrong, in this tradition of pop psychology that newspaper columnists, are particularly good at dishing out. This insinuation that recipes as bedtime reading is a kind of instance of displaced desire. And as I was plowing through these volumes, and I was struck by just how beautiful the descriptions were and the pleasure that we take in describing food and reading about food, not to mention cooking and serving and eating of food. It doesn't have to be explained in terms of some third factor. There's a sensuality to food writing when it's well done, and assuming that you're reading on a full stomach, that makes it, a pleasure that is complete in itself. And I'm thinking here about Esther's description of the Malida platter, from the cuisine of the Bene Israel Jews of Western India, with the daisy, fragrant red roses that are arranged around the fruit and the poha and the cooked, kachnar buds in Nadeem Aslam's account from Claire's anthology. And I thought that, the lines that really spoke to me were from Sarwat Haseen's Stone Soup, also part of Claire's volume. Where, and let me just read this, cook to make time stop, to make pain stop, but also just because food is good. You do not need to learn anything from the act of chopping onions. Just let yourself cry and enjoy them when they're crispy. There are no lessons here, only the simple pleasure of greed. I love that. And while Sarwat Haseen is talking about the pleasure of eating, there's also the point that Rana Safi in this other contribution to the same volume about how she's not just interested in cooking, but also in reading recipes. And I think that is where anthologies like these perform this really invaluable role, that they focus attention back on the food and the context from which it comes. And meaning making is never far, but it's not the focus, And I don't know. Yeah, did you want to comment on that? Or have you thought about how you when you frame these, what are the ways in which you frame these stories? Does that speak to you?
Yeah, a very generous introduction, and I'm really happy that you pulled out Sarwat Haseen's piece because I think it's so beautifully written. Rana Safi too, another contributor that you mentioned, she had such a kind of immersion in tradition and such a sense of the history of food, which was very different from Sarwat's take, which was hybrid and modern, and actually surprised me because the commission was really about South Asian Muslim food. And as a South Asian Muslim in the diaspora, she came back with pasta and taco parties, as well as kali dal and more, recognizably South Asian foods. So, each contributor, like Nadeem Assam, who you also mentioned, gave something different and unique, and I deliberately kept the brief quite open and was very interested to see the ideas that came back. But I think this point about the simple pleasures of greed and no lessons spoke to the kind of sensory delight that I think most of the contributors evoked in some way or another.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Esther seems to have had some problem with the internet and she's rejoining. So please continue. And may I request, once Esther also joins, to show the books to our audience so that they will, see. And Claire, you can show your book.
So that's Desi Delicacies.
This is the British version as well, which came out as Dasakhan, but we're really talking about the Indian.
Yes.
And this is the Bene Appetit, Esther Davidson. I think the illustrations are Esther's, but I'll say more about these in the end.
And since Esther herself is an artist.
Right. Okay. So that adds tremendous value.
Yes.
Yeah, they're beautifully illustrated.
Yeah. She's rejoining. She will rejoin, and meanwhile you can continue.
Okay. Yeah. I was I was reading these recipes and I didn't need to go into the kitchen to try and make them. But it was a distinction that was very hard to explain to my 7-year-old, because what we do is, we typically spend 5 or 10 minutes and we look up a recipe and then we go and make it. And here I was reading recipes night after night and, with no indication that I was going to go and make it. But I imagine that she will recognize, the pleasures of that, when the time comes. But to continue the discussion, and then we can include Esther when she joins. But I was also thinking of and this speaks, I think, more to Claire's book. That the recipes are reading them is so gratifying. I don't necessarily need to make them, and reminded me of how some of the characters in the essays and in the short stories and in your anthology, Claire, who are also making a kind of comparable distinction between cooking and eating. I was thinking of Annie, Zaidi's piece, chewing on secrets, and and she's describing the grandmother who is not a foodie. And she eats sparingly herself, but what she does enjoy is actually cooking. And she goes to these great lengths to when she discovers the grandchildren love ice cream, and she's resourceful, and she makes it for the children, and that's how she expresses her love. And I was thinking of this distinction between reading and cooking, and then between cooking and eating. And because you're cooking, you're not necessarily, I was wondering, and lots of stories I can think of, 19th century accounts of upper caste Bengali widows, who cook these elaborate meals that they're never going to eat. But also more recently, I'm thinking of, Punjab and Haryana and Rajasthan, where all these women, they cook meat curries and they take great pride in cooking them for their husbands and sons, and they have never actually eaten them. And they're not, in that sense, they don't invoke pity, they are not figures of abjection. And I thought, this dissociation of, which is, agency with consumption, that there are alternative modes of expressing agency, that these women offer us, or figures like these, who are maybe not so predominant, but nonetheless, in a number of your stories, they're hovering on the margins of the text. And I wonder how you would frame this, surrounding yourself with these temptations and almost, and not giving.
and thoughtful question. I mean, feminism is kind of hinted at in everything you're saying. I myself am like those women that you're describing in North India, because I don't eat meat, and yet my kids have never really got on with my cooking, and they've become big carnivores. So I do make them meat curry without tasting it as well. So this is something that transcends cultures. And similarly, putting the book together as somebody who doesn't eat meat, I tested all the recipes on my family but didn't eat those myself. So I think there's a lot going on, and I think why I was so pleased to do this anthology, especially at this really difficult time of the pandemic, is that I think, as you're hinting, food is a kind of language, and it's a love language. It's a way of expressing feelings. It can also be an abusive language, and women have been really ground down by the need to put the meal on the table thrice daily, which again is something that I felt during COVID. I think a lot of us just felt very ground down by the relentless nature, where we would have got some relief from school lunches and things, that we didn't have that relief anymore, as my kids were always here. And in our setup, although my husband's a feminist too, he's also a doctor, so his work carried on in the usual way, whereas I was just trapped in the house with teenagers. So I've had this love-hate relationship with food, and I think quite a few of the women writers in the anthology express that really well. You know, the Saliha Kamal piece early on in the anthology is about her sort of enjoying cooking, but also feeling guilty for liking it because of the women who have struggled or who have no choice. For her, it's a pleasant hobby, and she recognizes her privilege, but she knows that in a way she's standing on the shoulders of many other women who didn't have such a luxury as to bake blueberry muffins and take cupcakes to her workplace and share with her friends. You know, she's got a dual life, just as I have in my own privilege, but that many women, you know, it's never ending. And Rana Safi as well is talking about the time. I mean, she's nostalgic in many ways for the time that used to be given over to the grinding of the spices, the preparation of everything from scratch, but recognizes that in the modern world, a lot of corners are being cut. In many ways, she's lamenting that loss of really slow cooked enjoyment. But other people revel in it, like the Salvat Hassan piece that's all about shortcuts and hacks and hybridity and a complete lack of authenticity, and really reveling in that as a young sort of British Muslim. So there's lots of different angles on this, but the Annie Zaidi piece is a lovely one, because it's nostalgic for the grandmother whose cooking wasn't necessarily the best, and she didn't really enjoy it, but she had her signatures. And even on the family WhatsApp since her death, no one's ever been able to kind of find those secrets that we chew on in that particular piece.
Esther's back with us. So yeah, I mean, you know, before we went live on YouTube, we were talking about how both these anthologies are clearly labor of love, and the kind of effort that goes into anthologies like this, you know, how they take so much time and energy. But I imagine that, you know, that these things were a little easier for you because both of these anthologies were supported by grants. And I was wondering if you wanted to tell the audience a bit, you know, Esther, a little bit more about the process of putting your volume together, and then Claire, perhaps, you know, of the larger project of which your volume is a part, because that I thought sounded really, really important and important work that it's doing. So, Esther, if you wanted to go first.
I'll first show the book, the cover of the book.
That's beautiful.
And, and the illustrations are by me, and so that's the book. You wanted to know how this book happened.
That's right. It seemed like it was a lot of work, but also it seems like it was a pleasurable task as well, that you enjoyed, and all the people you met, and how did that come about?
Actually, it was a very long slow process. I had not planned about working like doing research, and it's not. I'm a novelist. I'm a storyteller, so it was not very much in my sort of plan of things. But things happen, in their own way. And I think that while I was writing and researching for my Jewish sort of subjects for my novels, uh, as you know, I live in Ahmedabad, Gujarat. And while the rest, I belong to the Bene Israel Jewish community, which is in Western India, mostly in Maharashtra, Mumbai, Alibag, and all these places. So we are just now about 140 Jews in Ahmedabad. So whenever I was writing, I felt something was lacking in my work, and because I'm very Gujarati in many ways, and I can't even speak Marathi like most Bene Israel Jews. So I had to travel first for the earlier books, all my earlier books. I had to travel to Alibag and also discover Gujarat, many places, and Maharashtra, Mumbai especially, and find out as to what it was, and then include these somewhere according to a situation. But then in Book of Rachel, I had already discovered in Alibag food that was normally Jewish food in the urban cities is cooked according to a slightly urban influences, So when I went to Alibag, I said, this is the real thing, because that's where we landed 2,000 years back, when we were fleeing persecutors from Israel in a ship, and the ship wrecked at Alibag. So we settled down in Maharashtra first. So there were some so Alibag still retains a certain flavor of our arrival. There are a lot of little feelings. And when I landed there from Gateway of India, you take a catamaran and you go to Alibag. And the minute I landed there, I felt I know this place. And there was something very real about the way, even the sort of food they cooked or the food they ate or the choices was totally different from what I knew in, say, big cities or urban life or Gujarat. So that is how in Book of Rachel, that was the beginning. I introduced each chapter with a recipe, but it was connected with the story. But that was it. But after that, I wrote Shalom India Housing Society, which was a collection of a lot of Jews living together. And it was very funny because Prophet Elijah comes there and all that. So we have during Passover, we have a thing that he enters Jewish houses for a drink, So I thought it was very funny and I wrote a novel around it. And at that point, the feminist press and Hadassah Brandeis, they put me on the cover of their calendar of the sort of known Jewish writers. So I said this was very, so till then I had not explored this area, And then I read about this various fellowships and grants and things like that, which I had never thought about. I used to only work with my publishers and that's it. So I said, first I said, let me try by documenting Jews of Gujarat. And then I got ambitious after getting so deep into the food through all these years now. So 4 or 5 years back, I applied and I received it. But it was very small, So yet I said, I took it as a challenge and I traveled. And I discovered 5 acres, 5 regions. Of course, Western India, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and then Cochin, which is the oldest, and then the Baghdadi Jews of Kolkata. During that time, somebody sent me a small film about the Bene Ephraim Jews of Andhra Pradesh. So that was even more exciting. And by then, I read about mass migration of Bnei Menashe Jews of Northeast Mizoram and Manipur emigrating to Israel. I saw all those clips on. So I said, and every time, 3 of my books were translated into French. So when there was a what you call a launch in France, people would ask me, are you really a Jew? Because I wear this bindi and all that. So I said, yeah, can I touch you? I said, yes, please. So that's how they wanted to know what an Indian Jew looks like. But during some times I was doing festivals and their food was East European. And this is what we know basically. Western Jewish life and Western Jewish food through cinema or books or everything. And very little is known about Indian Jewish life or Indian Jewish cuisine, which is definitely very different, but it has a lot of influences, yet it is Jewish. So I said, okay. So I sat down and that was a lot of work to how to create the whole proposal about Indian Jewish food. How is it different? Because we are what you call Asian Jews. And so far only we know about Western Jews from various sources. So
Right.
that is how it
Ted, about your project?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So my funding came from a larger project which is called Forgotten Foods, and it's run, the main principal investigator is a historian from the University of Sheffield called Professor Siobhan Lambert-Hurley. And Siobhan got a whole group of us together, from chefs and foodies to food historians and even plant scientists. And so we've got lots of different strands to the project, but it's all about South Asian Muslim food. And even we're trying to recover lost heritage rice varieties with the help of scientists and plant experts. So it's been really exciting, but also it's been quite difficult because no sooner had we got the money than the pandemic hit, which meant that a lot of our plans have really changed, and things that we were planning to do in person, like, for example, a Dastakoi event, had to go very quickly move online. So it has been quite interesting and difficult in many ways. But for me, because I was in charge of the literary strand, it actually wasn't as bad as you might think, because I think I was saying to you before we went live, writers, I was able to commission, I was in the fortunate position to have a little bit of money to pay writers properly. And as it turned out, people with alacrity accepted the commission and produced really exciting work because they had a bit of time on their hands for the most part. The only exception I would say is Sam and Maha, who had planned to do investigative journalism and produce a new piece on food for me, very kindly. But because of coronavirus it was spiking in her hometown of Karachi at the time, then instead she offered this wonderful piece which had been published in Al Jazeera before, which is all about the burger as a metaphor, but also as a material, a food object. So I was really happy to republish that, but nearly all of the pieces were original.
Yeah. Why Muslim food? It's a big issue, and there's that. Did you very consciously choose that in this?
Yes. I mean, as it was explained in my introduction, I have this interest, which is not to say that I'm not interested in other religions in South Asia as well. But I think because I had a really formative year in Pakistan when I was a teenager, I applied to do a year of teaching in India, and the Indian project was full. So they sort of said to me quite casually, oh, well, go to Pakistan, it's quite similar, it's next door. And very naive, I was only 17 when I arrived in Peshawar. Then I just went along, and it really changed my life in the most positive ways. And I also spent time in India, and I spent 4 months studying actually in Hyderabad, which is why it's a particular pleasure to be speaking here today. So I was at what used to be called CFL, it's now called EFLU, so really wonderful small literature and language institute that I was allowed to study at in the very early noughties. And there was a marvelous chef there, just unforgettable Mughlai chef in Hyderabad. So another seat of Muslim culture, just by chance, because it was good for my academic pursuits. And so I guess my interest has always been, especially in that hospitality culture, in the pleasure taken with food, and also in the fault lines with Muslim food, especially in recent years. Especially I'm thinking of beef lynchings and things like that, where I feel very frustrated, and I want sort of people to see another side. I mean, the same thing happens in Europe with like halal debates about the cruelty of halal, that it's used as a stick to beat Muslims with. I mean, I am vegetarian, but I really strongly feel that none of us are pure when it comes to food. I mean, food has a very serious side, and it's very hard to be completely sustainable or cruelty free, and that the way Muslims eat at home is often very different to the kind of image of this rich meat heavy food. Is extremely diverse, as I hope my collection shows.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking of in this kind of rough and ready account of multiculturalism in the West, the 1980s is, described as this time when the immigrants were welcome, but not their cultures, and whereas more recently, the tendency is to welcome the culture, not the people. Your food is welcome, and but not you. And I was thinking of something, I was actually reminded of members of Donald Trump's team that was responsible for the government's very racist, Mexican policies, and they were seen dining in this Mexican restaurant, and they didn't seem to think anything of it until the other diners chose to remind them, of that contradiction. And I think we're seeing something quite similar unfolding in our midst here in India. You have there's this recent embracing of Christmas by this urban middle class, and everybody wants a Christmas tree, and everyone wants a plum cake, and so on. But there's no sense of outrage or any kind of solidarity, when the community is under attack or the churches are vandalized. So and again, you think of the middle class, a lot of kids from non-Muslim backgrounds will have Muslim names because they sound poetic, and that kind of goes hand in hand with this really xenophobia towards the community. So I thought your anthologies were, I think, by locating the recipes so firmly, in the religious and cultural context from which they come, they're discouraging that kind of selective appropriation, and that's true of both Esther's volume, that there's a full context that is provided, that where do these stories come from? Where do these meals come from? Where do these recipes come from? And I think in that sense, they're performing this really important cultural work. And, is that, do you see that framing as relevant to how you thought of the
yes, because normally people have asked me, how is Indian Jewish food different from Indian food? But we have to remember one thing, that Indian Jews follow the dietary law, the dietary law of kosher. So outwardly, it may look as if it's all the same, but it is not, because we follow very strict. The one thing is thou shalt not mix the lamb, thou shalt not cook the lamb in its mother's milk. So we have a direct separation between meat dishes and dairy. So all the sort of recipes are based according to dietary law. And each festival has a specific recipe that has to be made during that time. Whether it's a festival or you have to break a fast. So you break it only with this. So there are two things that happen. One is regional influences, and one is memory of the land of origin. The five Jewish communities of India have come from different places. Like say, like Ben Israel is from Israel. And so we have something called chicha halwa. It's made with coconut milk, and coconut milk is the thing that works as a good dietary law. It's neither dairy, it's nothing, it just makes it helps a lot. And they are from Israel, Cochinchis from Spain, and also local Malabari. And Andhra Pradesh, they have a long route they talk about from Persia to Far East and back to Andhra Pradesh. Then Kolkata, the Bhattari Jews, they are from Middle East. And the Mizoram and Manipur, they again have a long route like the Bene French Jews of Andhra Pradesh from Persia to Far East to back to sort of North. That is how. And each has a method of how do you follow the dietary law. So that is how it was difficult to, and the second thing was language. In some places, English was spoken, in some not. And also, most of them were very religious, very, very, very religious. So they follow the strict laws, and accordingly, the food is made. So it looks, when you take a photograph, it looks regional, but it's not. There's many, many, many differences, as I told you, like using wheat extract and coconut, or say sometimes it's black rice pudding, but made with coconut milk, or fish egg curry, which is again fish egg made in a different way. Each thing is made differently. And also, like say, normally we Indians, we put ghee on chapati, right? Now that's not, if you have a non-vegetarian food, again, dairy enters ghee, so we can't. So that sometimes to sort of not make a mistake, rice flour chapatis are made. And kala, which is the, the bread that everybody knows about, the Shabbat bread, which is like a plated bread, plated. Now that is not available. It was available in a Jewish bakery in Calcutta, but all over India, we never had. Like the whole problem is like the West, we can't buy things off the rack. We have to make it ourselves. Like during Passover, we need a date, sort of like something like a shira. So it's not available. So we make it ourselves. So this is how the whole process goes on in India, where we have to work very hard to create the perfect Jewish meal.
Right.
And that is, I think, one of the major things how Jewish food is different. And the country of origin is definitely a sort of like, say, in Northeast, it was totally different from the rest of India. But the one thing that is common between all the Jews of India is the Shabbat Prayers. And if we can't get the khala, that we don't, but in Northeast I saw khala, in Kolkata I saw khala, and now some women are learning to bake khala. But to keep it really Indian, we prefer flat chapati.
Right.
Akri. That is the way to symbolize Shabbat. Shabbat is common between all four. And as we don't get kosher wine, that is again a problem. So all over India, all Jews make grape sherbet. Sherbet made with grape. That's our wine. Right. So that is a common thing. The second thing is Passover, which is common. We use the same ingredients. So that way, there are a lot of...
Is it frozen? Are you there?
Huh?
Claire, Claire, did you want to respond to that, or?
The issue of context, I mean, just briefly to say that, some of the writers really wanted to place food in their context. And the one that springs to mind from my anthology would be Sadat Hussain. So he's a celebrity chef in a sense, and a food historian, and a really warm and funny fairly young man, who it's been my privilege to speak with on a few different platforms that we still haven't met. In fact, I've not met most of these people. But what I liked about his piece was he took the most common and kind of humble Indian combination of chai and samosa, and really sort of traced the origins Also in his own history from, being a young boy, he said his ambition was to be the fattest boy in the world. So he's always been a foodie. And when he was young, him and his friend would be fighting over, they would always divide the triangle of the samosa, and they would be fighting over who got the fatter potato laden half of the samosa. And it was only later he realized he could have sliced it from top to bottom and had a fairer exchange. So he really goes through chai, and admitting that he wasn't a tea lover, but how he came to sort of train himself as an adult to enjoy tea because it is so central. So I really loved how he placed these in context and gave a lot of the history and also the personal history. I mean, there were other examples I could give, but I feel like I'd like to hear more from Esther. It's so interesting what you were saying just now about all these improvising and the dietary laws, the coconut milk as not breaching any dietary laws. I of course, it's like a vegan trick as well, but very interesting.
It is very much. Yes.
And the paradox is delicious, isn't it? That the desire to preserve your identity, the distinctness of your identity, actually involves a substitution that brings you closer.
Yes.
You want to maintain the dietary laws, and you end up using coconut milk, and that brings a kind of similarity with the regional cultures, isn't it? The further you go, the closer you come.
It sort of, we communicate better. It sets the dialogue, and it sort of, it's like I felt like one big family all over India while I was traveling. Everywhere I went, I was so welcome, and especially in Andhra Pradesh, so much hospitality. So much love, and they do this for you, and they want to make this for you, and it was just so beautiful.
Yeah, which very nicely takes me to the next kind of comment that I had. I was thinking of how intensely symbolic food is, and how intensely symbolic food is, and and for those of us who are working with literary texts, like all three of us here, the symbolism of food is especially inescapable. But I was nonetheless startled by, the reference that you had to, to the bowl of lemon juice on the Seder table, Esther, and or the salt water to remind the people, who have gathered for this celebratory feast of the bitter tears that were shed in the diaspora. And then there were other things, that, the bitter first course again, that reminds people of the suffering. And is that the date mixture that's said to be the mortar, between the bricks? And so this symbolism is one thing. You think of sweetened yogurt, and that is offered to a student going to take the exam, and and you think that's auspicious, but it's a common enough association, but it's not why sweetened yogurt, why is that auspicious? It's not as self-evident as salt water for bitter tears. And so there's a certain kind of, there's a literalness, the food is literally memory, that you're remembering, the food, the different aspects of the food that actually recreate that history. And in that sense, do you think that literalism of Jewish food is something specific? Or, I couldn't think of anything comparable.
No, very specific, very specific. And each event, now our New Year will begin in about 4 to 5 days, Rosh Hashanah. And that's the time when platters will be prepared, and that will be quite similar by all the 5 communities. And they will all have the elements of the earth, happy elements, not like Passover. So there will be fish heads, and there will be pomegranate. And we will start the New Year with apple slices and honey. Make a sweet new beginning. That is with apples and honey. And with that, all the various vegetables and fruits are put in the platter. So, and with Shabbat, of course, and candles. We light candles for everything. So that is how it's very specific. Like say, I told you about the bitter wal. You refer to bitter wal, bitter beans. Now that is for the fall of the second temple. So there is a certain sadness, bitterness, but now we are free. But let us not forget, that is the whole thing. So we have one dish which is bitter, that is sprouted wal beans. So everything is specifically made. Even a fast of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, it starts with grape juice. The fast is a long one, and we break it with Shabbat, fake Shabbat. But we have to eat something, and it's the most delicious Kippur Chipuri, which is like a flaky pastry. And a lot of friends, when I serve it to them, they think it tastes like baklava, you know. So that's what I talk about the country of origin. Okay, I mean, basically it looks like a karanji or a ghugra, as we say in Gujarat, but it has some elements of the country we came from, and you can feel it when you have it. But that flaky pastry is made only during Yom Kippur. With the so everything is specific. We just don't have a dinner with a thali with chicken curry and rice and these. No, there are rules for everything. It's very strict. Sometimes it's also very difficult. And very difficult to prepare. As I told you, nothing is available easily. So we make most things ourselves, like what I wrote about unleavened bread for Passover. That is made by hand. Although now from the US and Israel, we do get factory made matzo, but we prefer our own. We prefer our own bhakri, and that is made just like that, rolled on an upside down tawa, and that's it. So what I mean, it's specifically made for it.
I was thinking, even in Desi Delicacies, there's a reference to, some of the Bengali meals beginning with the shukto. That's the bitter first course. But it's got a very prosaic explanation. It's to get the digestive juices flowing. It's not so freighted with meaning as I think even unleavened bread. This idea that you did not have actually time, and it's reminding you of the moment of the time in exile when you didn't have time for the bread, for the dough to rise, and therefore you're living in a hurry. And that complexity of emotion, that it's a celebratory feast, but you're also still you're remembering and going back to that. I don't find that couldn't find anything comparable, and I was wondering if Claire, you came across and all this reading of and symbolism is there, but do you think quite in this way, or?
I can't think of anything from the contemporary things that I've been reading on Muslim food, but I was reminded of the Parsi story of stirring the sugar into the milk to say that those earlier settlers in India from Iran saying we'll add something sweet, we'll blend in, but we'll improve society. I've always thought that was a beautiful story, and it chimes with some of the poetic very symbolic ideas that Esther has been talking about, which it's so interesting speaking to you, with the Gujarati side of things, because it's also very recognizable to me, because I'm from Old Woodley, which is the area of Leeds that is, I grew up in a very Jewish community, though I'm not myself Jewish. We're Irish heritage, but the going to friends' houses and the different plates for meat and milk, and it's in one way it's very recognizable, and I know India, but the two things together is something new for me that's very enlightening.
One last, since we have maybe, I think, which has not come to tell us it's times we are run out of time. So this one, I found recipes for Malida in both volumes. There's Malida and the two, it's spelled differently, but and I thought, I went back and I thought, but they're very different things. So the Malida that Esther talks about is flattened rice and served with fruit And the Malida that Claire's volume talks about is leftover rotis that are then cooked in ghee and sugar, and I think Malida refers to the texture of it. That it's mixed up, but they are both they are very different.
Yes.
From each other.
So, who wants? You want Claire, or shall I?
You go, because I think you'll know more about. I'd love to know the etymology of this word, since they're such different dishes.
Well, I've been sort of asking a lot of questions because I did not receive religious education for a very long time. So I had to do all this on my own. And Malida is like Indian prasad, I would say. And it's also a beginning to everything like Ganesh, we sort of make an offering. So we have Prophet Elijah, Eliyahu and Nabi, to whom we make an offering. There is a wish fulfillment. Everybody has a secret wish fulfillment. And when that wish fulfillment is done, the platter of a Malida is offered. In the Jewish case, it's sweetened poha with coconut and nuts and fruits and roses for sweet fragrance. And a lot of prayers are said around it. But that sort of is a sort of an offering. And if you read the Bible also, you will see that the Hebrew Bible, that everything is an offering. So this is also an offering we make to Prophet Elijah, the Malida. That's fine. Is that okay? Yeah.
I think the Malida that Annie Zaidi talks about in her piece, it's because it's a leftover dish, something to do with the stale parathas and roti. I love this idea of the kind of leftover, the thing that you do with the leftovers. I think in British cuisine, the nearest thing we would have is a bread pudding, the old stale bread. But also I'm thinking of things like bubble and squeak, the potato and cabbage that you haven't used, that you can just fry it up and make something delicious. And in African American culture, gumbo, as a sort of a melange and a kind of bits and pieces of stuff. Was where I think Annie's piece is coming from.
But this is Malida is an offering to Prophet Elijah, and it's very happy. It's a happy feeling, and all new beginnings are done with a Malida.
Right. Yeah, I think the way we use this, to reduce something to Malida is I think for me, so the way Esther uses it was totally new, because the way I think it's used in everyday language. In Hindi, for instance, it refers to the texture, which is mush.
Yes.
So it's like pulp. That is, but that's not the texture of flattened rice. That's
no.
It's
very
different.
And it's subtle and delicious. Both.
Right.
And sweet.
Right.
And just right. It's not going overboard about making an offering very, very elaborate. Just correct.
Fantastic. Before I close this discussion and Vijay opens it up for questions, I want to take a moment to mention how beautifully produced these volumes are, and both include these delicate illustrations. I think Esther did her own. And what rang really true for me is the blurb on the back of Claire's volume, which notes how the kitchen is often the heart of South Asian homes. It's not the bedroom. It's the kitchen, and when you want to indicate someone's status as a real intimate of the family, then you speak about, you refer to how they come straight. They have direct access to the kitchen. They come straight to the kitchen. Is to indicate that so that that was it was that the recognition of that was great. With that comment, I wrap up the discussion, and many thanks to Esther and Claire for this conversation, and over to Vijay now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ida. Thank you, Claire and Esther. I think, what should I say? I think from appetizers to desserts, we have discussed the entire course, and needless to say, we are actually looking forward to more of this. and I'm sure many of our readers would love to get a copy of your books. And there are a few questions and many comments, of course, but a few questions also. And but just before I take up the questions from the audience, something that struck me was two different things. One is what Esther mentions in her book, language and food tell us who we are and from where we came. And also, I think last session of HLF Online, we were talking about Parsis migration. So I think these things, migration, food, and language, they all seem to go together. How much of what you retain and how much you adapt, and the struggle to retain the tradition and yet become part of a new land. I think these are some of the very interesting, whether it is Indian food in places outside South Asia or outside food in India. I think there is always that kind of a tension between what originality that you retain and how much you adapt. And thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And one question that Anusha Hegde asks both of you very quickly, brief comment on in Indian urban culture, global cuisine is restricted to the elite classes and spaces. What are your comments on such unconscious class division in the context that you have seen? So is global cuisine limited to urban culture, number one, and is it class specific?
Well, in Gujarat, everybody sort of likes it, so I don't have anything to say about it. All classes.
Yeah. What about you?
Great question from Anish, and I would point you to the essay in my book by Sanam Maha, which is about the burger. And it's, in fact, in Pakistan, unlike India, the burger is used as a pejorative term for a westernized Pakistani, someone who speaks with a British or American accent and maybe wears Western clothes. And there was a viral video earlier this year, actually, with a Peshawari girl in the northern areas, but speaking Urdu with a very sort of English twang that went viral. And I think the burger has, it came to Pakistan in the early 80s and has started to become, it's more widely reached than just the elite. But I think it's certainly true to say that across the world, things become more mainstream, and then other global food, like maybe Thai food or, Vietnamese, things that are not so familiar, that becomes the new elite thing, just as the burger or the pizza becomes a little bit more accessible, if that answers the question.
Claire, I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you have noticed this, but many people feel that, at least in India, the earlier Persian influence is getting, in a way, replaced by the Arabic food habits, or so suddenly you have the Arabian mandis sprouting everywhere, and many people said that the earlier Persian influence is probably giving way to the more Arabian including cuisine. Is that something that you noticed anywhere?
Yeah, up to a point. I mean, in Pakistan, which is what I know the most about, there's definitely been a tussle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, both putting money into mosques and things, and I think Saudi has more clout and is probably, it is dominating to some extent. I'm not sure though that we see it in food so much. There's certainly, I think Shias in Pakistan are under pressure more than they were a generation ago. That's indisputable, and it's really, really sad. I think in cuisine, I mean, so many of the words are the same between Persian and Urdu when it comes to food. And I think as with what Esther was talking about with the Jewish community, nonetheless, there's a distinctively South Asian spin on both Persian and Arab food. I mean, I think when writers touched upon this issue in my anthology, there tended to be a slightly disparaging sense that Persian and Arab food is all very well, but it lacks, it's not Swaddish, it's not as tasty or spicy. Yes, you know, there needs to be that South Asian twist. So I'm not sure. I think there is something independent about South Asian Muslim food that looks further east.
Yeah, it's like in many small Chinese restaurants here, at least in Hyderabad, I'm sure it's the same everywhere. You know, you have Chinese food being cooked with curry leaves. So, and obviously you add more spices than any Chinese curry would, any Chinese noodles would have. But Esther, there is this question to both of you. Claire might remember this. When this session was being planned, I was a little hesitant to have the session with all three women because that might be a very stereotypical, reiterating the stereotype of food and particularly cooking, cuisine being a woman's subject. Then, of course, Claire said, no, I mean, it's all right. You know, we'll have fun talking about food. But there is a question related to that. Did you come across, this is by Ramakrishna, who is asking, did you come across this cultural construct that cooking has to be done by women, particularly in the domestic space? You know, men could be, star chefs, etc., outside. But when it comes to the domestic space, is it a given that only women should be cooking the food at home? Is that something that you? What would be your comment on that? Sir?
Me, okay. Well, in the Jewish community, men have equal responsibility for many things, like serving or making Shabbat or bringing a lot of things and putting all that together and helping. So, because women we have a matriarchal society, so they have a certain way of getting things done. So both work together.
I see. What about
in a Pakistan context, the Aurat March, which has become very big in the last few years in Pakistan, the Women's March, one thing that caused a lot of controversy was a poster that said, Khud khana garam khalo, heat up the food yourself. And it wasn't just that the women were suggesting that the man could make his own dinner. It was that kind of disrespectful, not sort of ligie, but a kind of order that was causing a lot of debate. And Saliha Kamal talks about that in her piece. And she talks about this very issue that you describe, where men are khansamas and celebrity chefs, and women just sort of do the drudgery. But I think there's a lot of women countering these stereotypes, like the women on the Aurat March. And many of the contributors in the volume, and the feminist men who are allies, like Esther was talking about. Yeah.
I know Ira was talking about symbolism, and something that is associated with food is fasting.
Yes.
So I mean, if feasting, has its own symbolic meaning, abstention from food. What does that indicate? I mean, what has fasting symbolically? Why is that important? Not taking food, right? So how is that important? I mean, did you come across that idea? For example, Claire, you talk about how during Ramzan people fast, and how do they break fast, etc. So, I mean, what has that to do with, because in relation to food?
Well, I think Ramzan came up a lot at Iftar, the kind of denial, but also the flip side of fasting, as you suggest, being feasting. It's a month that even not very religious people really take pleasure, especially in the Eid celebrations and all the food that comes along with the end of the month of fasting. It's about, for the religious, obviously, it's about sort of really concentrating on your faith for that month and on charity and so forth. When I think about fasting and symbolism, I also think, that there's a very great symbolic value to it comes into political protests, and Gandhi, was the pioneer in that regard. But more recently, Bobby Sands in the 1980s, the Irish, his hunger strike to the death. It's such a powerful symbol, self-denial. It can also be gendered, where women fast for their husbands, protection, and so it's tied up with, I think, politics, with identity and self-denial, but also then the looking forward to the end of that. There's a sort of hope there, as well as the kind of self-denial aspect.
Esther, is there this concept of fasting in the
Yes.
Jewish tradition?
Yes, it's very important, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, for fasting, because that means prayer and contemplation, asking forgiveness, and one of the parts is for all that we should not have done and everything, and all that we should not have eaten also.
I see. Yeah, given that Jewish food follows very strict dietary laws.
Yes. So by mistake, so you ask forgiveness for that part also.
Right. I think we have to bring this wonderful discussion to an end with this, and there are many comments. People are loving it. Thank you very much for this conversation about food writing, what it means, and what it symbolizes, and what it tells us about the people, their customs, their traditions, their histories, and their places of origin, and all this coming into this wonderful mixture called Indian food tradition, what each community brings to Indian food, and this whole notion of what is Indian food is actually something that becomes so complicated once we understand that as one of you said, there is no question of this purity business, and so therefore I think food is a very important element, which at a very, if I can say that, unintellectual level, tells us what we are. So thank you very much for this discussion, Esther, Claire, and Ira. Thank you for conducting this conversation this evening. And once again, on my own behalf and on behalf of my colleagues at HLF and all the audience, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion on food writing in both India and in South Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Esther. Bye-bye.
Nice meeting.
So ladies and gentlemen, with that, we come to the end of this session, and we'll be seeing you once again 15 days from now with another edition of HLF Online. Till then, take care and good night. Thank you.